All right, here we are live with episode number 55 of the Trauma-Informed Educators Network podcast. And I am more than excited about today's guest on the podcast. I actually was just on one of the guests' podcasts, his podcast, and he has brought the brilliance of a colleague of his that I cannot wait for you to hear from. So welcome, Jesse Kohler and Dr. Mason, to the Trauma-Informed Educators Network podcast. The first thing I ask everyone is, hey, tell us about you and I think how you came about as a psychologist and a policy advocate. How did you two come together and to combine your forces for the greatness of trauma-informed work?
Matt, it's so great to be here, and Dr. Mason is a key part of the podcast as well, which we'll get into later. But I met Chris back in April, I think it was. It might have been May. No, it was May because I was walking to a vaccine appointment for the COVID vaccine. So that's a good timestamp. But essentially, her organization, the Center for Educational Improvement, wrote a letter trying to persuade the Department of Education to leverage ESSER funds in the American Rescue Plan Act, the elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds, to address the psychosocial, emotional, and spiritual well-being of students through the development of trauma-informed practices. And for myself, as the executive director of the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice, my eyes were bugging out of my head, I'm sure, as I was walking down the street. And, I reached out to Chris and she was very quick to respond. There was one person, a mutual connection that sort of brought my attention to this in a different way, Susan Mullane. So just to give her credit for sort of bringing us together. But Chris, before I go on about the work that we've done, are there any missing pieces? Sort of what was the formulation of that letter from your end?
Yes. Well, we have been working for decades trying to do something to alleviate the trauma and to help children and youth feel more safe and secure and to increase their well-being. And as we went through the pandemic, we could just see it getting worse and worse and became more and more concerned. And we realized when the Department of Ed came out with these ESSER funds that we had an opportunity. It was millions of dollars. We were very concerned. And we formed what we called the Coalition for the Future of Education. You can go to my website. You'll still see information there about that. But anyway, we worked with principals across the United States, mainly principals, but some other thought leaders, and said, what do we need to do? And we came up with a platform of about 6 things that we needed to address. And part of it had to do with policy, hence working with Jesse. And some of it had to do with practice and research. And we wanted to make sure that we impacted not only what's happening in schools, but also thinking about accreditation and licensure and training for principals and teachers. Because, far too many administrators and teachers don't know much about trauma. They don't know about the neuroscience of the brain. And in these days, this is almost criminal. I mean, to know what we know about the brain and neuroplasticity and not use that to enhance the well-being and to accelerate learning. So anyway, that's a little more of the backstory. I'll just say that Sue's a dear friend of mine. I was actually a professor in Montana when I met her. She was a student of mine. She's in Alaska and still does research and consultation, but she joined Jesse's network and hence the connection. But I'm an educational psychologist and also a yoga meditation mindfulness instructor. And my long-term dream is to bring all this together to really enhance what we do in schools.
Well, I know the listeners here know that I firmly believe in the practice that you use in school, as we are a Be Well in School where we do teach mindful breathing and movement to help self-regulation skills and as well as co-regulation abilities of the adults, right? It's equally about us as it is the kids. And I think you said something, Dr. Mason, that resonated with me, and that was, we know more right now. And if we don't do something, it's almost criminal, what I refer to as malpractice. And my paradigm shift happened 8 years ago. I remember when it happened. And when I learned the neuroscience and the impact of trauma, I knew from that moment, if I didn't do something different, then I was committing malpractice. So I love that you say that, because I feel that When I speak to people, I talk about act or accept. We either act upon the new information that we have, or we're just going to sit back and accept it, and we're not going to do anything differently. So I 100% agree with that. If we know better, we have to do better. So let's get into why is now such a great opportunity? Because I firmly believe that as well. Why do you all believe that right now, in December, moving into unbelievably January of 2022, why are we in the midst of opportunity for this work?
So one place to, again, just reinforce is that, the American Rescue Plan Act, built on top of the investment made into the ESSER fund from the CARES Act back in 2020, providing $150 billion that went to local education agencies, right? 90% of those funds were supposed to go to local education agencies, directly to schools and school districts. One of the allowable expenses is addressing the mental health of staff and students. For me, the need for trauma-informed education existed long before the pandemic. It existed when I was a student. I lost my best friend when I was in school. I didn't have the supports that I needed that could have helped me recover more quickly. And when I got those, they actually happened outside of the school environment. And, every child is in school in the United States. And so there is always an opportunity for students that are experiencing overwhelming adversity, developmental adversity of any sort, complex stress, to get that support. But we are seeing through the pandemic, all of those needs exacerbate right now. And we are seeing a lot of really critical, concerning issues across the country: violence in schools, youth suicide. I mean, some, difficult things to talk about, but substance use and the loss of hope, because we are not meeting these students where they are. We're not meeting staff where they are, and we're seeing staff burnout, turnover at rates. Schools are taking mental health days where they don't have enough staff to staff the entire school building. I mean, we need a systems change. And the last thing that I'll say before, handing it off is that there's also research that supports that within the education system, we need to change the way that the system is structured because of the impact that the pandemic has had on very young babies that are going to be entering into the education system in the next few years. And our system needs to be prepared to make up, in some cases, lower IQ scores, and in some cases, different social and emotional abilities because of isolation that's taken place early on in their lives during developmental periods. And there are still critical periods to build back on those skills, potentially build back stronger than our current education systems currently does. But we need to come at this from a systemic level to meet the needs that our country currently faces. So that way in the future, we have the workforce we have the country that can still function and operate the way that we need. And there's a critical time in our existence is right now.
Well, and I think what you said too is the majority of people have experienced something, right? And this has not been traumatic on everybody. I think that's really important for us to say. It's been an experience, but it has not been a traumatic experience for every single person. But isn't it interesting how when everybody experienced something, all of a sudden it becomes a topic. We have to talk about it. When there are communities across our country who for centuries, decades, have experienced adversity, and yet we just wanted to turn a blind eye. And now I think you're right. There is an opportunity because now people in general have experienced this. And I think that this is the time. And I think what you just said as a principal of an elementary school, I can tell you our kindergartners came in developmentally further behind than I even was worried about their academics. Their social and emotional health and their skills were much further behind than any other subset of students that we've ever seen. And I think we have to have those conversations. Dr. Mason, where does your work fit into this? Because you've done this work for a long time and you're probably like, finally, we're having a conversation about it.
Well, let me just start by saying, when I listened to everything that Jesse just said, I think about the importance of self-care too. Self-care, not only for the students and families, but for the educators. And you know what the research says, that if we are in kind of a bad state and we are stressed out, our brains aren't going to work as well. So if educators, teachers, principals walk into school buildings feeling stressed to the max, we're not going to be as effective. And so what I'm telling people is we need to take some things off of our plates. We need to look at the job satisfaction of teachers and principals. We need to listen carefully, consciously, and to become consciously aware of what can be done effectively. Many people went into education because they had a sense of heart about what needed to happen. And we've blocked that. And we've blocked that for many, many years, where we were pushing. And so I think where we are today is not only a result of the pandemic, but it's a result of ignoring what our inner being was telling us about what we needed to do in schools. So the work I've been doing with Yale, for example, relates to the mental health of students. And there's a whole network of what we call the mental health technology transfer centers. There are 10 of these centers across the country. And in the last 2 years, and these are funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, and in about the last 4 years, they added a school component. So you think about ESSER's funds, and then you think about these centers that are set up to help guide schools so that they can more effectively address the mental health needs. So more resources are available. I just completed some work with Dr. Staley on teen suicide when we did a course for a platform called Michigan Virtual. And that's going to be disseminated through Blue Cross Blue Shield. So we know that there are interests and there are resources, and schools are floundering. They're totally overwhelmed. And we also know, as you said, Matt, that this is the perfect time for something that's disruptive, something that'll come in and help to promote a substantial change. We cannot tweak the system. One of my greatest fears for the last 15 years is that when we would wake up, we would say SEL is needed. We would only do the bite-sized pieces. And so you might have an SEL program that meets twice a week, and you don't work on generalizing these skills into classroom situations, because, you have to practice the skills. They aren't just, sit in a circle and talk about it. No, you've got to actually implement it. And you have to know in your own being what it feels like to self-regulate, to calm oneself down, and to be able to see those differences and to listen carefully to the kids, to watch them and say, oh, rather than going on for 15 more minutes of academics, let's just stand up and do a stretch break. Let me just say, hey, let's get back to think carefully about what it is you want to do today. What can we do together?
And I think Dr. Mason too, it's, I hear this, well, what do you do with kids who elope or run out of the classroom? Well, I try to figure out why they're running out of the classroom.
Right. Exactly.
Because if we just punish them for running out of the classroom, then we're not actually building any skill and building their ability to understand whatever is overwhelming their system to get them to run out of the classroom. Is it challenging? Yes. Is this work challenging? 100%. Is as an adult myself to stay regulated when maybe a parent comes in hot and they are accusing me of things? Yes. And I'm a grown adult with a fully developed brain, and I'm not 8. So we continue to have these conversations of what you just said. If this is skill building, it was a book in the mid 90s. I don't remember the author, but he said, what do we do if students can't read? When they come to school, we teach them or provide interventions. If they can't do math, we provide interventions. If they don't know how to behave, we punish. And that, to me, resonated so deeply, where we put adult expectations on kids that do not have the skill at that point to meet the expectation. And then we punish them for not being able to do what we expect. So I think you hit that nail on the head. So let's talk about we're talking about change a lot. And I don't know if you know, but I am under paradigm shift education. Paradigm shift is kind of a big thing to me. So let's talk about that social change. How do we get the change to occur around this work? Because that's the $1 million question, I feel, is how do we take the pockets of knowledge that we have, even people like myself in schools and the teachers that I work with every day who get it. How do we get this social change to occur?
Can I just start by talking about visions? So visioning is one of my things. And I believe we need opportunities to talk with teachers, parents, students about visions. We need to empower youth to tell us what they want, what's important to them, to get them engaged, and then to have the freedom to make some mistakes, because it's not going to be perfect. We will make some errors as we go forward. So we need these small practice communities, right? And then we also need to think about the things that Jesse's doing with policies, and practices and funding and the things we try to do with our trauma podcasts so that people continue to become more and more informed. But I think it starts with these small dialogues about visions, about what could be, and then looking elsewhere to see what else someone else has done. Because there are some wonderful things going on. Not every place is floundering to the same extent.
I agree 100%. And I think in my school, we use the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People as our grounding. And a lot of people don't know there's actually an 8th habit, and it's called Find Your Voice. And it is our kids' favorite. And I'll tell you, it's interesting because our kids use their voice. And boy, adults sometimes don't know how to respond. I had a substitute who a child felt like they were being wronged. And I'm going to be honest, I think the child was kind of being wronged. And the child called the adult to a circle, asked me to facilitate a circle so they could air their grievance of what happened and use it. And I'm thinking, this child is not only standing in this confidence of empowerment, but being able to voice what was done that they felt wasn't right. The adult was not ready. The sub was like, I don't know what's going on here. But boy, isn't that so true? We've got to listen to our kids. Habit 5, seek first to understand, then to be understood. Quit worrying about what we want to get across and actually listen to some of the things our kids are trying to tell us. I think it's so powerful. Jesse, talk about this social change from your perspective.
Yeah. So the first thing that I'll mention following up on that, Matt, is that, what trauma-informed education sort of does through the process that you just beautifully illustrated is that it actually creates a participatory democracy. It creates the conditions under which people understand that not just in voting, but voting is certainly a part of that, but just in the actions that they're able to take, and they feel empowered that their voice can make a difference and that their perspective matters in the overall decisions that are made is so important to the functioning of a democracy to its very core. And that is sort of a very real and critical effect of trauma-informed approaches broadly, which is another reason that we need them in this country. For me, I'll just talk to the 8th habit because that's sort of the life that I live right now, is using my voice, right? And I'll just say that, for me personally, I got into the policy space from community work and learning how to advocate, becoming an advocate, and then becoming that megaphone through which other people are also becoming advocates through our campaign has been such a healing process for me. To take my past pain, what I've experienced, and try to work toward a future in which other people don't have to experience that same pain. I think that social change happens when groups of people, there's 2 ways of creating influence, right? You either are born into it essentially, or you have just money and power, or there are huge numbers of people that create change and sort of advocate together. And while the 3 of us have different stories, your listeners each have different stories, everybody comes to this podcast, to the trauma-informed movement with lived experiences of stress and adversity, if not trauma or vicarious trauma, by seeing other people have to go through that, right? And understand the importance of it, understanding where the gaps in our system currently lie. And when we feel empowered to speak up, when we see, to Chris's point, the vision, what it is that we're working toward and where we are today, and we can, through a narrative and some data, draw a through line of how we reach the ends that we're trying to get to. That is how social change happens. And we've seen with various movements that when groups of people stand together in a chorus and sing a similar song, if not the same song, that is when we start to move mountains. That's when the unthinkable of how are we ever going to get there becomes a reality that we begin to live into and continue to develop.
And don't you think too that sometimes even when that chorus and that song is on the same, there's somebody on the other side singing a completely different song, fighting against the song that you're singing. And I think that that's important to understand, that this is the opposite of how education was developed in our country. Education was developed in our country for a few, right? Not the all. Not it is now where it now has a broader perspective. My mother, she had a sister I never met who had was an exceptional child who was put in a school, a boarding school, and wasn't allowed to be educated because they didn't think she had the capacity. Right? That was in my mom's lifetime. Even during my parents' lifetime, we had segregated schools. We had where kids by the color of their skin couldn't go to the same school, right? I mean, these are recent things. And so when we're talking about giving kids voice, wow, I mean, that is, and as simple as it sounds, that is disruptive in nature to the core of the roots of education. Isn't that ironic that giving kids voice is really an open idea of shifting education? It blows my mind to think about it, honestly.
Just add to that, Matt, that we also have research that says that if you're interested in something, if you care about a topic, you're apt to learn more and learn more effectively, more efficiently. So, I mean, on top of just helping kids to feel that they're part of the solution and that we care about them and their lives, there's something really practical in terms of accelerating learning through focusing on things that kids care about.
And it's mind-boggling to me because if you listen to adults talk about their jobs, they want to feel ownership. They want to feel, like they have a say in what happens. And, after I worked in a public school for 1 year in Philadelphia before going into my master's in educational leadership. And that's when I started on this policy track that's taken me to where I am now. But seeing the disengagement from students because it was just a tracking system. They were essentially on one of those, moving sidewalks in an airport, and whether they wanted to go somewhere else or not, they were just going on that. And the only way off was essentially that they saw to just hop out, right? They either left or they stayed on, and to not have that ownership, to not feel like you are in control of that process. It so disengages the learning process at a developmental stage when we are building capacity. More than the exact skills within academia, we are learning how to learn, and we are disincentivizing the learning process from an early age in so many ways.
And I want you to know, I am an educator. I've been one for 15 years, so I'm not talking bad about educators because I am one. But the reality is, educators feel they're not being heard right now, and they haven't for a long time. And I think we talked about that earlier, right? And I always connect my role as an administrator to the teachers I work with. They don't work for me. I work with them, right? And I think about what I do to ensure or try to ensure they have voice. And then I go down and say, what do the teachers do for the kids to ensure they have voice? And there's gaps in all of those links. There's gaps between administrator. There's gaps between the community and the administrator and the school. There's a gap between the administrator, the district and the administrator. There's a gap between the administrators and the teachers. There's a gap between the teachers. But it all comes down to voice. It all comes down to just being heard. And I think that is such an integral step that we have to have a conversation around. Not necessarily this podcast, but on the bigger scale. Yes, Dr. Mason.
If I could just add, back in the 90s, I spent 3 years back in school. I went back as a teacher. I had a background in special education too, been a professor. And it was a middle school in Virginia in an urban area where the kids came from like 80 different countries, spoke 50 different languages. And it was such a wonderful experience to talk to these youth, many who were new to the United States, had only been here a few years, and to find out what they cared about. And then we would read about that together. We would research things together, and they would write about it. And I still remember how these kids were so thrilled that someone asked them, like, what would you like to learn about? I remember we had one unit on the brain, and I had two boys who wanted to study hamster brains. and one girl whose grandmother was deaf and she wanted to know how hearing worked. And I mean, these were such exciting projects, and the kids were so engaged, and it made teaching so much more fun just to be there with them and to facilitate their learning.
And Matt, to what you said really quickly, like, we'll get into a deeper policy conversation, or at least somewhat of one, but just to what you said about educators' needs. I mean, in so many ways, educators are constricted right now to in so many ways, in so many environments, not be able to provide what we're talking about. So by no means do I want to put blame on educators. We are talking about systemic change that needs to happen to facilitate the opportunity for teachers to not feel the stress that they currently feel, so that we can lead with compassion and empathy and meet students in this way. And like you were talking about, create this whole school environment of shared responsibility for each other's psychosocial, emotional, and spiritual well-being, as well as the physical well-being of everybody in that environment.
I'm glad you said that, because that is it, right? And it's funny because I used to say we're trying to shift a broken system, and I was corrected and say, actually, the system is operating exactly how it was designed, right? And so I think we have to have those conversations. This isn't a teacher problem, right? We're not having a teacher shortage. It's not a shortage of teachers. It's a broken system that isn't understanding why teachers are leaving. So we want to giving more money will not get educators to stay. I can assure you that. So I appreciate that. This is about a bigger picture. This isn't the first grade teacher at my school that we're talking about. This is the systemic pieces of federal government to state government to local districts to schools. It's this whole through line of how do we shift this, one, so we understand the psychological, emotional well-being of students, staff, and communities. And I don't call it social emotional learning anymore. I call it social emotional health, because it really is about health. This isn't about teaching the 5 core competencies. That's a piece, but it's not the only piece, because we understand that this actually has health outcomes in the long term. So let's talk about these policy pieces. What are you two working on right now together around shifting the policies around education?
So again, a lot of our focus in Chris and my relationship so far together has been around the American Rescue Plan Act and ESSER funds, and trying to leverage those as very flexible federal dollars that are going directly to, most of which are going directly to schools and school districts. So that has been a large part. There's another bill that I just want to mention as an example, right? Because we could go down the list. There's a lot of legislation that is out there at the federal level, is where I focus, that is focused on education. Especially right now, it's a particularly hot topic. But there's an example in the Rise from Trauma Act that sort of illustrates how policy creates conditions within communities that allow for better practices, right? It is not the whole picture. We need for better practices to exist. We need for people to be learning and sort of implement those practices, which could exist without the policy, but policy makes it a lot easier and, again, creates those conditions. So within the Rise from Trauma Act, Section 101 is a big talking point for us, where there is a grant program that creates funding for community development to create trauma-informed communities, essentially funding coalitions to come up with their own programs and projects at a broad level. In the second section of the Rise from Trauma Act is about workforce development. And one of the pieces is creating that shared language and understanding that is so core to a trauma-informed culture for educators. It provides hundreds of millions of dollars to provide that training at a very high level to educators and other key community leaders. And whether or not the Rise from Trauma Act passes, what I think is important to illustrate here is how advocating for federal funds creates those opportunities to move what we're talking about forward here today, right? There are other pieces of legislation. There's the Safe Schools Act. There's, various pieces that play multiple roles in the broader system. But, that is sort of the role that policy can play in systems change. And again, the role that advocates, going back to how social change happens, the role that advocates play in promoting that policy change, in helping with reauthorization language and making sure that policies are recorrected and we reanalyze where policies are currently traumatizing communities themselves and where we are missing the boat. People's voice and being a part of our, again, participatory democracy in that way, in addition to just voting, is so critical as we continue to find the right formula, if you will, to allow school environments to cooperate in the way that we're trying to illustrate here on this podcast.
Dr. Mason, what would be your ideal policy change from a child psychologist standpoint, from the work you do? What would be the ideal?
Well, I believe the ideal probably is the thing that actually Jesse and Jeff Eichler and I've been working on. We have a podcast series that's probably, Matt, similar to the one you have, where we've invited various people to come and talk about how they're addressing trauma in schools. So it's the Cultivating Resilience to Alleviate Trauma in Schools podcast series. And we have psychiatrists, psychologists, mental health providers, teachers, administrators, students, parents coming and talking about what they're doing and what could be done. So part of my vision is that we begin to talk about what's possible and what's going on, so that we make the things that could be possible very concrete and relevant and vivid in our hearts and minds. So we can find examples that will help motivate us and inspire us to get better, to do more with what we have. Because, there are a lot of good resources there right now. One of my big fears, again, has been that people will implement something that's hodgepodge. It won't be what Michael Fullen would call coherent. I think we need to recognize that there are ways to have like restorative practices in schools and teach students that they can come together in a circle in the morning and talk about their concerns. That is a good daily practice, can be done year after year after year. So students know that they have a place to have a voice, consistently. So I think that consistency is really, really critical. But I also believe that we need to build what we call compassionate school communities, so that compassion, actually, if you look at it from a psychologist's perspective, it's huge. You can have a list of like 100 different character traits or virtues, and they're good. But, if that's where your focus is, you may get like 2 lessons on honesty and another 2 on kindness. And then it doesn't always come together the way it should. But if you know the research on compassion, it says that with compassion, we actually open our hearts and minds. There's this vagus nerve that goes from the head all the way down to the gut, that when that is opened, we can intuit or feel at the heart center and actually inform our being, our intelligence, before it gets to the brain even. And there are practices we can do to alleviate stress, to increase self-care, and we can thread those throughout the school days. So we need people to understand that, in fact, so much more could be done. And as we do it, we feel better. It's not that it's a burden. And so part of my vision is that I don't want teachers or school administrators to feel like we're asking them to do one more thing. It's not that at all. Rather, to just shift, as you say, paradigm shift a bit, so that we build this compassionate school community. We have better self-compassion and better compassion for each other.
Well, and I think Dr. Bruce Perry was on this podcast, and he was saying, we don't need educators to be therapists, right? We just need those, what I refer to as micro-positive interactions. That is research now, his current research is showing just flooding kids with that positive interactions all day through school. And I feel like that is something that is doable in every school, literally January, whatever day you go back. Matter of fact, to the point where I have my teachers mentally noting the affirmations versus correction. Just keep a conscious. And I actually went in and did an informal observation at the end. And this was by no means a gotcha, because I want them to do it to me as well, because sometimes I can do corrections versus affirmations even with the staff. And I found that one teacher did 30 corrections to 3 affirmations. And I didn't correct her. I said, what can I do to support you? Because if that's what you're doing, that's where your mind is. That means that we've got to do something for you to support so you feel grounded, right? And so I think these pieces, and Jennifer just said something too that I think is really powerful. She's listening in live. She said that there's so many great resources out there. However, they get diluted to the point where SEL gets a bad reputation. PBIS is one of them. I have really deep feelings on transactional interactions versus relational interactions, but I won't get into that. But I agree with you're saying that we have to be cautious on how we just try to make it sound simple, because it is, but it's not. It's really shifting a paradigm. And then there's a second thing, Jesse, when you're talking about legislators and talking about these policy changes, I would love to know, how are legislators getting this information? I was very honored to speak at the National Legislators Convention that came to Nashville. I think there were over 100 people in the room. And I shared a lot of research. I shared a lot of things. And there was a gentleman, and I'm not going to tell you what state, and I'm not going to tell you what legislator it is, but he came up to me, and if you have small children listening, please mute me. But he said, I'm going to tell you what the kids need. They just need their ass whooped. And that's exactly was his response to what I had just said. And so I respectfully said, I respectfully disagree. That isn't how we fix it, because that's what we used to use, and it didn't fix anything. But how do we get this information to the people who are making the decisions?
So, the legislators broadly rely on their staff for information, right? When we advocate, so infrequently do we have the opportunity to have that sort of conversation. Hopefully they generally are more positive and productive than that one. But usually it's communicating with staff on key issues that the staffer is in charge of, or a few key issues. And so you advocate to them. That staffer brings their own background information. The legislator brings their own information. There's a few problems here where, there are a lot of people who are legislating about education who don't have experience as educators, right? There is a major disconnect in that reality that does exist. And so that's one of the reasons that advocacy is so important. But they rely on the information that they get from their staff. What is happening in their district? What can be done and legislated upon differently? One really good illustration of this, we interviewed someone on our podcast, Peyton Barcel, who just finished her first semester of college. So congrats, Peyton. But when she was in middle school, her father passed away suddenly. And she was not treated well at all. And she went on a campaign to talk to as many people as possible about her experiences. And eventually what happened is that she passed a state law in Nevada mandating annual training about ACEs and trauma for every teacher in the school.
Nice job, Peyton.
It's a great job, Peyton. I'm excited to see what you do with your career
Absolutely.
when you're not also in school.
Right. Wow.
But, so that source of information where, so many of us, we look at the same areas for the information that we gather, right? We all have internal biases that sort of direct us in specific ways. And so to have those advocates speaking to staffers or speaking directly to legislators when the opportunity exists is sort of that critical piece to begin the paradigm shift for legislators themselves, to provide them with a new way of thinking, a new thing to look at. That's a critical piece of it. And then you also have briefings and, opportunities like that, or speaking at, and it sounds like it was the National Conference of State Legislators. People come together in those sorts of venues as well, but that advocacy piece is ongoing and always there.
Awesome. And I think for the listeners, that's something we need to understand, and we need to know what avenues. And I'm going to honestly replay this on the Trauma Informed Educators Network, which has over 28,000 people from around the world, 100 different countries. And I want to tell them, this is what we've got to do as a next step. We can't do these we can't do this work in little bitty pods of isolation. We have to start moving this to a bigger scale and demanding and wanting better, not for necessarily ourselves, although that does include, but for the kids that we see every single day. And I think what Peyton did was she advocated for herself in that space of like, no, this is what happened when I was in school, and I don't want any other kid to have to experience that. Mm-hmm. And what power does that speak? For sure. Absolutely. Here's a question that I think we need to get to. And Dr. Mason, I think this kind of probably fits right into the work you do. Jesse Graham asks, we're going to have to do some healing after all of this, right? As educators, I think everybody has to do some healing and some self-work, right? Educator or not. But what does it look like for educators after this, whatever this is? I think it's probably COVID, but there's just a whole lot going on. So what would that look like? And I think with your experience, I would love to hear what your perspective would be.
Sure. Well, I want to just point out, in addition to COVID, we have, intergenerational racism and injustice. And we have school shootings. We have teen suicides. So the list of things that we're dealing with is huge. And then we have violence in video games, violence on TV, and violence on our news. And so we're inundated with this violence. So my most recent book is called Cultivating Happiness. Notice the shift from violence to happiness, and then happiness, resilience, and well-being. And I really believe if you look at those three things, and we could have teachers and others dialogue together about even, those small moments of joy. And this is a mindful perspective, right? Where you're conscious of, wow, that water just tasted so good today, or that deep breath. It was amazing, because when you really breathe deeply, that breath can go throughout your whole body and it can flow back and forth. And you can get such a sense of relief. Your body can feel this expanse instead of being constricted and feeling the weight of the world on your shoulders. It's amazing how quickly we can shift our consciousness. So part of the self-healing is working on self, so that, in fact, we get these sensations using all of our senses, walking on the ground and feeling the earth beneath our feet, talking to a grandmother and just having, again, the experience of being there for a family member and listening to their stories and just feeling the joy of connection. Those things can be so critical. And that's what life is about. Where's that sense of meaning? Where's that sense of hope? Well, a lot of it comes when we feel like, even in the midst of all the awful things, that we can recognize something beautiful has happened. We had,
and I think,
they go on and on.
I think too that there's those opportunities every day that we can do what you just did, right? And I think I call it the power of the pause. Just pause. And this doesn't have to be an hour. This can be minutes. It can be the power of the pause. Check in with yourself. Check in with your emotional self, your physical self. I think it's so powerful. I didn't learn the power of the pause when I was a kid, which is why I was a 21-year-old that would tell you what I thought when you didn't want to hear what I thought, right? But it is that power of the pause. And I think there's another key. And I'm going to show you this. And I just pulled this up on my phone. I hope you can see it. This right here is a way to continue focusing. This is a previous student that was at my school who came back last week. And here's what I want to say. If we could just get students to affirm their educators from the past. You all, this changed me. When he walked up, I thought it was a grown man coming to check about his child at school. He's actually in high school. And his mom said he had to come up here to talk to you. And I said, he has no idea how much I needed that. I needed it probably more than he needed to see me, right? And I had to take that moment and be in that space with him to understand, boy, we had some hard times when he was in 4th grade. And I mean some rough times. And yet he still finds his place of safety back at the school that I'm blessed to lead. And I think those are the pieces. This is seed planting. This isn't necessarily, we don't always get to see the tree. I got to see the tree, and it is a big, tall, strong tree, But sometimes we don't get to see that. But it is nice sometimes when we do get to see the tree, because sometimes those seeds are planted and the tree grows in a different forest. But I think those power of the pause, connecting back and seeing the work in its fullest is so, so, so important. So as I said, 45 minutes, you all, was going to go really fast. Can believe it or not, it goes so fast. So I want to ask you both something, take as much time as you need. What do you want educators to know right now? One, and then any other closing things, resources that you might have, next steps that you want to share, anything that you want to share. I want you to get that in now, because I told you this was going to go by really fast. Dr. Mason, we'll start with you.
Wow.
What do you want educators to know, and what resources can you share?
Well, I think first, know that a lot of what we're talking about is something where you don't have to have expensive equipment. It's your breath. It's sharing. It's learning about self-care and practicing yourself, because you're going to have a hard time helping students understand if you don't know physically what that feels like, mentally, emotionally, what that feels like to have that self-care. And then I think from that very authentic place, we branch out and build communities and build confidence and caring and nurturing. But we do it knowing what it feels like and that we can take care of ourselves. And from this, I believe, then we can layer on what's needed academically, cognitively, because there's such a powerful connection between how you're feeling, your sense of well-being. If you are afraid or uncertain, insecure, there are huge blockages that happen in the brain. It keeps pulling you back to brainstem and saying, oh, threat, and then you can't focus on learning. So please go ahead, take those moments and be aware, and then help others to feel that authentic awareness and sense of belonging. There's so much divisiveness right now too. And we've got to help people understand what being in community is like, and how in community we support each other. And our community really is a global community. It's not just our classroom, right? It's across borders.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing those. And Dr. Mason, if they want to, you are quite the author. You have several books. Can you tell them where they can get your writing and how they get access to your work?
Sure. So I have like two websites. One is my author's website. It's Christine-Mason.com. Pretty simple. And then my business is a nonprofit, the Center for Educational Improvement. We have a monthly newsletter called Heart Mind E-News, where we give tips like this. Everything is research-based, and that is at www.edimprovement.org. So thank you for asking. And I just have to say, there's a whole series of books we have on mindfulness and community building and what we call heart-centered learning. And it all fits together. I mean, it really does. And it fits so well with the work we're doing on these trauma podcasts and the work that Jesse's doing.
Absolutely. Awesome. And it sounds like Jennifer, actually, who's been commenting here, has had the pleasure of working with you. So that's awesome that she's had that experience as well. So Jesse, what do you want educators to know? And then tell us about the resources that they can find from you.
Yeah. So, man, I want to say so much and don't have the time. Like you said, it just goes fast. I want for you to know that, you have some of the most important jobs possible in terms of spending as much time with developing minds as you do. It's not just in terms of intervening in problems and sometimes having to even go so far as maybe even feeling like you need to treat the problems that exist in today's world. In doing so, we're actually preventing issues in the future, right? Not only is the job to prevent developmental adversity, we need to reduce the progression of adversity across the lifespan. And in doing that, when we get to the next generation, we are helping to prevent developmental adversity that helps to work toward a thriving and prosperous future. I also, again, just want to reiterate that a lot of the laws and legislation and policies that are developed are that sort of constrain educators in so many ways are either outdated. I can say that the Pennsylvania School Code was developed in the 1940s during a particularly traumatizing time in our nation. We can talk about trauma at a systems level right after World War II. And, they are outdated. And then current policies are again developed by folks that don't necessarily have the lived experiences in the classroom dealing with students day to day like you all do. And so making your voices heard, making sure that people understand what it's really like to be in a school environment. How can we make schools better, not just for students, though it is critically important to make schools better for students, but also for the adults, administrators, teachers, the custodians and bus drivers, the cafeteria workers, everybody that makes up the school environment. How can we make this better for everybody? And to make your voice heard, to advocate, to be a part of the movement. And if you don't feel comfortable advocating to an elected official, that's okay. We understand that. But tell some other folks and activate some others who can get involved. So to Jesse, first of all, love the name. But also, you can sign up if you go to traumacampaign.org. You can join the National Trauma Campaign, where we continue to cultivate advocates. We have advocates in all 50 states developing relationships with their elected officials. And, in addition, just sort of illustrating the groundswell of support that exists for these sorts of policies and programs. The one thing that I want to highlight is while I talked about federal legislation, a lot of the legislation that controls the school system happens at the state level. And even more so, we are seeing the need for advocacy at the very local level with school boards as well, right? So to get involved at the grassroots and make noise. I saw the comment earlier that SEL is getting a bad rap. I think that just the loudest people in the room right now are talking about SEL in a bad way. And there is the absolute possibility to talk about SEL, PBIS, trauma-informed education, and fill in the blank from there, right? That is not a comprehensive list. To make that noise again, create that chorus, sing that collective song so that we can start to talk about it in a better light and really spell out how, the other side of the story, if you will, and why this is necessary. So go to traumacampaign.org. Please get involved. You can also go to CTIPP.org. That's CTIPP.org. That has other resources. We are continuing to come out with episodes of the Cultivating Resilience podcast. You can find that on any streaming service or at queticocoaching.org. If you search Cultivating Resilience, a whole community approach to alleviating trauma in schools, you will find it through Google as well or on Spotify. And then we are having a workshop series called Building the Movement to Prevent Trauma and Foster Resilience, which you can find on the National Prevention Science Coalition to Improve Lives website, as well as PACE's Connection. It's been posted where you can sign up online. It's completely free, but we will be sort of illustrating the breadth of the trauma-informed movement and really using that as a way to mobilize and activate advocates around the country and hopefully around the world as well. There's so much more that I want to say, but because of time, I'll just end with a true and honest thank you for the work you do. I know that the last 20 months, the last however many years has been certainly not easy, but the work you do to make a positive influence in children's lives, in families' lives, in communities is so, so critically important. And I hope that we can do more to support you while you do so much to support everybody else.
So I've already gotten one request. Jesse, I need you to go on the Trauma Informed Educators Network Facebook group of our almost 29,000 people. And I need you to put that on there. If not, send it to me and I will post it on the group because it is a very active, on fire group for this work. Dr. Mason, same thing. If you send me those resources, I will post them onto that group so people are aware. And I want to encourage what Jesse said about being involved on a local level. Our state right now is looking at the BEP funding on how they fund school districts. And yours truly, the only school administrator in the whole room, took my little badge off and did not say the name of my school and said I was a principal. I was a father of a 10-year-old. And I shared my thoughts around why we need to redo the funding and how it's allocated to districts. I've also spoken at many different places and advocating around the work I know. It is a stepping outside of that box and into the risk. And I understand that there are people that aren't willing or know they can't take that risk due to whatever would happen to them. But that is such an empowering thing. And I felt very empowered around being able to step into space and use my voice in that way, not just for my students, but as for my own child. I always use my own child as one of the reasons why I advocate, not just the students in my building. So if you are not following me, you can follow me on social media here at Principal List on Twitter and Instagram. I say Twitter is where I really just put my deepest thoughts. Instagram, you may see a picture of my dog, who knows? Or you can follow me on Facebook and LinkedIn. Facebook is any of those networks, and LinkedIn is just myself. I do post more professional things on LinkedIn. Facebook, if you follow me personally, it really isn't that exciting. You may see what my child is going to get over the holidays. Who knows? Nonetheless, thank you for doing the work you do every day. Thank you, Dr. Mason, for being on here. Thank you, Jesse, for being on here. And as always, please, 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 if you need to, wear a mask and wash your hands.
Thank you, Matt.
All right, I just paused the podcast. I just paused the podcast. There are still a few live people on here. Jennifer, I will definitely get those resources posted to the Facebook group. Thank you guys so very much for sharing your expertise and those resources, because I want to use the network that has been developed to try to push this and support the work that each of you all do, because it is so important. And I couldn't thank you enough for being on here and sharing an hour of your time. I told you, Jesse, it'd go by really fast.
Oh, man, it's crazy. But thank you so much. This is awesome. And I will most certainly post the resources that we have. And in the future, when there are ongoing calls to action, I will continue to post that directly to your network on Facebook. The community that you've cultivated is unbelievable.
And it's, again, selfishly, I just wanted to connect to people who are like-minded. And I'm glad that I did, because it's been inspiring for me too. Well, thank you guys so very much. If you give me just a second, people that are on live will be back, not next week, but the following week. And I'm going to be honest, I think it's Nate Postlewaite, who was he spent part of his life in foster care and is coming to share the power of resilience and the power of people who are connected to him in his life experience. And I know you all are going to love hearing and talking to him. So please come back for that. For Dr. Mason and Jesse, give me 1 second. I'm going to turn off this live, and then I want to ask you one more thing. Thank you guys very much, and I'll see you in a couple weeks.